Everyone to CG seminar stroke webinar number 259. And what a great topic we have for the first webinar of 2022, regulating fair access to higher education in England with Chris Millward and Vikki Boliver. Before I introduce our speakers though, let me take you through the webinar protocols briefly. Now, keep in mind that the webinar is recorded. It goes up on YouTube within 48 hours or so. You can link to the webinar through our website as well. And we also post the chat function on the CG website. Now, once the webinar commences, we advise you to use Speaker View, which is located there in the top right-hand corner of your screen so that you can more clearly see who is speaking at any given time. Now, please keep yourself muted during the webinar. We pick up sometimes extraneous noise from people's lives, which disrupts the flow of conversation. And you don't need to have your camera on either during the webinar. But please remember that when you come into the discussion, turn on both your camera if you can, but also, most importantly, your microphone so that we can hear what you're going to say. Now, to enter the Q&A section of the webinar, which is the second half of the proceedings, we ask you to use the chat function. Post your statement or your question in the chat, and then we'll compose the speaking list on the basis of what's coming forward there. When you're invited to speak, as I said a moment ago, remember to turn your microphone on, and when you come onto camera and are about to speak, explain who you are, your name, and where you are from, and then come forward with your own statement or question. It's a pleasure now to hand over to our speakers, and let me introduce them. Chris Millward is the Professor of Practice in Education Policy at the University of Birmingham. He's just started in that role. He was the Director of Fair Access and Participation on the board of England's higher education regulator, the Office for Students, between 2018 and 2021. And previously, he was Director of the Higher Education Funding Council and of England and Head of Research Programs at the Arts and Humanities Research Council. So he has a history in policy and public administration in the sector, and prior to that worked in the universities of Warwick, Edinburgh and Durham. Now, our second speaker who will comment on Chris's main paper is Vikki Boliver, who's also at Durham, has a Durham connection. Vikki is the Professor of Sociology at Durham University. She's a CG researcher, and I might say well known to all of us who work on access and participation and equity issues for the stellar contribution she has made to research, particularly in relation to access, participation and social justice in the UK. As I said, Chris will give the main paper, Vikki will comment. Now, Chris's paper is already available to us as a working paper, as a CG working paper, and Trevor will be posting it during this webinar. So you'll be able to access Chris's thoughts, not only through through what you hear him say, and through the recording after the webinar, but also through the paper itself. At this point, it's a delight to hand over to Chris Millward. We look forward to what you're going to say, Chris.
Okay, thanks, Simon, and hi, everyone, and Happy New Year. Whilst I just share my screen and try to post some slides, let me just say something about the background to this session. We announced in the AFS that I would end my period as Director for Fair Access and Participation at the end of 2018, probably last summer. And at that point, Simon and I had an exchange where we talked about me running this session, sharing my experiences, and in particular, lessons learned. So that's really what the focus of the session is. But actually, as I started to think about the session, it also became clear that it would be beneficial to write a working paper to go with it, which I've done literally over the last couple of weeks. When I started writing that, it was very clear to me that you couldn't really talk adequately about what we'd done during the 4 years I was the access regulator without talking about the 12 years before it. when there were two directors for fair access, or indeed the broader currents of policy in relation to increasing participation in English higher education, whilst trying to maintain funding levels in universities, maintain quality, and of course for the government minimising the cost. And access regulation throughout has to a certain extent been positioned as providing assurance that the increase in fees that has happened progressively in England, albeit repayable after graduation and subject to salary thresholds, that increase would not put off the most disadvantaged, or indeed that the regime over time would indeed improve their position. So with that in mind, I'm really going to cover a wider period than the 4 years I worked in the role. And I'm going to cover really 3 or 4 phases. So you've got white papers happening in 2003, 2011, and 2016, legislation in 2004 and 2017, and implementation of quite fundamental reforms in 2006, 12, and 18. So I'm going to talk about what was behind those changes and how access regulation was positioned within it. And indeed how it was pursued. I think one of the things I do need to say is that, some of the benefits of this session are the immediacy of it. So, I've come straight from being the access regulator, so I've got a very immediate perspective on it. But of course, it's to a certain extent a biased perspective. I've got a very subjective view, and we can't yet really see what's been the effect of my period and the changes we made during that period. That's particularly challenging at the present time because we have a government where COVID has disrupted any real fundamental policy decisions, and indeed a slightly uneasy coalition within the government. So they don't have a settled position on higher education policy. And one of the patterns I'm going to describe is certainly since the December 2019 election, a pushback against increasing participation in higher education. But despite that rhetorical pushback, a lot of work to actually increase the places in higher education and enable people to get in. And we don't really know whether that's a response to COVID and disruption during COVID and some of the real challenges and unfairness that flowed from that. Or actually, ultimately, it's very difficult for a government to cap higher education participation, to take steps to push back on that when there's such high levels of demand and it's so rooted in the kind of aspirations and expectations of families across the country. The other thing I was going to highlight is me giving this session as somebody who's worked on policy nationally, but now working in a university. Sets an interesting question for centres like CGHE about how you link together a policy perspective nationally, which is very broad. And you'll see in my session, it's very wide ranging. It has no kind of real disciplinary roots. It uses bits of public guidance. It uses some data. It engages with some different concepts like equality of opportunity and merit and human capital. But that's very different to a lot of the work that academics do in universities, which is more focused and more rooted in disciplines. And I think one of the interesting questions is how you deal with a big policy question like levels of participation in higher education, access and participation regulation within that, in a way that's rigorous and draws on all the work across the sector and doesn't compromise on the rigor of all of that. And I've often found trying to bring together the evidence means piecing together different pieces of evidence coming from different researchers across the country. And it's really important that centres like CGHE can do that, but do it in a way that's rigorous. So the questions I'm going to address are, firstly, what issues have access regulation in England sought to address? Secondly, how have the access regulators pursued this, and what have we learned from that? And then thirdly, how might that change, and what might be the effects? And I'm going to look at that across, 4 main phases. So firstly, 2 phases under Directors for Fair Access, under what was called the Office for Fair Access, initially from 2006 to 12, where it was really about annual agreement of largely bursary contributions to students. Then secondly, a much more substantial and growing area of work from 2012 onwards, where again there were annual agreements, but it extended more into outreach, to a certain extent student support, and then more work at the sector level on good practice. When there was legislation and the OFS was set up, Offa became part of the OFS as a regulator, so the regulator of higher education, and we moved towards a 5-year cycle of access regulations, giving universities longer, but to a certain extent expecting progress in return, expecting universities and colleges to reduce the gaps we could see in relation to equality across the life cycle, and getting different parts of universities to work together on all of that. We were also able to use funding and data and analysis to establish a kind of bigger sector infrastructure to support the work of individual universities and colleges. So I'll talk about what was the rationale for that and what we think happened. And then lastly, it'd be good to reflect at the end about what might happen next. And you'll be aware, certainly if you work in the English sector, that the government's published guidance which suggests a pivot away from universities promoting access themselves to their own institutions and more downwards towards working with schools on school grades. So I'll reflect a little about what might be the reasoning behind that and what might happen next. So let's start with the first phase that I showed. So access regulation was mooted in the 2003 white paper and then ultimately legislated for in the 2004 Act. And this was very much part of the pursuit of a 50% young participation target by the then Labour government, framed, as I've quoted here, by the then Prime Minister as the pursuit of a society genuinely open and based on merit. And the language around this, of course, the language around increasing higher education participation is very much about more graduates enabling a knowledge-based society and economy, and the use of merit and meritocracy, suggesting that would be more fair and there would be opportunities for all. A few years after that target, the government was strongly persuaded that universities were going to increase participation whilst maintaining quality and their global standing in this country, that fees would need to increase, and that would have to be an additional financial contribution to universities on top of the existing grant. And that's what ultimately was passed through Parliament, repayable fees of up to 3,000, but at the high level subject to an access agreement. And it was framed very much in terms of providing more money for students. So some of that fee could be used to provide cash for the poorest students, but crucially also more money for universities so that they would be able to sustain quality and standing when all this happened. The focus was very much on the most selective universities, the kind of assumption that only they would be able to charge the higher fees or command the higher fees. And of course, they also had the most progress to make on access, given the strong link in England between school grades, admissions, and the stratification that flows from all of that. The access czar was mooted as a kind of compensatory element, and certainly it enabled the passage of the fee through Parliament. So in return for the higher fee, universities would pay a certain amount in terms of bursaries to the poorest students to stop the fee acting as a barrier to those students. That was broadly the philosophy. And the legislation, the regulations, the guidance, and indeed the appointment of the first access regulator, who was a former Vice-Chancellor, former President of the UK, was intended to navigate very carefully what was seen to be quite a controversial change. So the legislation, the regulations and the guidance focuses very strongly on protecting academic freedom in relation to admissions, universities themselves deciding on which students should be targeted, or how you might define underrepresented groups in their own context, and then cash being promised to students and students knowing about it before they apply, so it could influence whether or not they decide to go and where they decide to go, and particularly enable them to choose to go to the most selective universities. That was the kind of broad philosophy behind it. What we saw in practice between 2006 and 2012 is more universities than expected, virtually all of them charging the higher fee. So a lot more investment flowing through, increasing from 99 to 387 million broadly during that period. Also, towards the end of the period, increasing evidence that bursaries, where most of the money was spent, didn't really change behaviour. So they didn't really affect access in a context where students knew that this was really about repaying money after they'd graduated than doing a lot up front. There was also quite a lot of evidence that this didn't really shift access to the most selective universities, which of course have been an important part of the case to start with. From this point onwards, I think what you see is a kind of doubling down in the approach. So in 2010, once a coalition government had been elected, there was a desire to reduce the cost of higher education as part of the broader fiscal retrenchment during this period following the banking crash, but also again to continue increasing participation and to enable the continued good resourcing of universities, which fees would enable. So instead of an additional fee on top of the existing grant, what you see is substitution. So broadly, £3 billion taken out of grant to universities and put into student finance to enable an increase in fees, which would then be repayable. If you look at the language used around this time, it's very similar to the language that was used before, even given the different political colouring of the government. So I've quoted here some text from the National Strategy for Access and Student Success, which was published in 2014, and it talks about higher education benefiting everyone. So it's important for individuals to unlock their potential. It doesn't show it here, but this talks about social mobility and reducing inequalities. It also importantly talks about the benefits to everyone and the economy of having graduates. A point of view, of course, we debated at the last CGHE seminar, and we might want to talk about again at the end. So broadly, it's the same purpose, the same pursuit of what you might call a knowledge-based society and economy, the same faith in meritocracy and the role of higher education within all of that. What you see, though, is much higher fees and much higher expectations of universities in relation to this, both in terms of what they spend and in terms of what should come through in terms of the outcomes from all of that. So there was a very clear set of negotiations within which the most selective universities agreed to pay £1,000 of the additional fee income in addition to their existing commitments. And that was seen to a certain extent as a tax, but something that was necessary to enable the fee to happen. A much stronger push to invest in outreach to schools and colleges and communities, not just bursaries. And quite a lot of push for that outreach to be shown to lead to improvements in access, ultimately, particularly in the most selective universities. So a big increase in spending, a big increase in activity, a diversification away from just bursaries towards more outreach, and to a certain extent supporting students on course. What we see during this period is, again, a big increase in investment. So from 564 million to 785 million, again, because most universities were able to charge the fee. At every stage of the fee increase in England, the assumption has been that only the most selective would be able to command the higher fee, but actually in practice, demand has been able to sustain higher fees for many parts of the sector, and that has driven up the investment of activity through access agreements. This takes us through pretty much to the establishment of the OFS, and so the replacement of offer with the role I filled, the Director for Fair Access and Participation, in 2018. So it's worth just pausing and thinking about what happened during that period from 2006 to 2018, what kind of progress was made. One thing we can say is that the 50% young participation target was achieved in 2019. So these measures succeeded in achieving the goal that was set nearly 20 years earlier. What we saw was, in my view, an expansion of opportunity, so increasing and widening participation in higher education. But because there was very little progress in the most selective universities, and indeed all parts of society increased their participation in higher education, I would argue there was expansion of opportunity, but not necessarily an improvement to equality of opportunity during that period. And that's because we had a very stratified entry, actually in a more competitive system, potentially becoming even more stratified based on school grades and the inequalities around achievement in school. We also saw quite differential outcomes for students, both at the system level and within individual institutions. So we saw what we sometimes call structural differences in outcomes, because so many more students from the most disadvantaged and the poorest backgrounds entered institutions which had lower retention rates and tended to have lower rates of progression into graduate employment and the highest paced jobs. There are also, though, when you look within individual institutions, differences in outcomes, lower retention rates for the poorest students, and particularly an ethnicity awarding gap between Black and particularly white and particularly Black students within institutions. Another important pattern that we saw during this period is the decline of part-time, shorter cycle provision and entry for mature students, including whilst they're in work. And all of this meant that despite the success in achieving the young participation targets, I think what we saw when I started in post in 2018 was increasing concern about what was being achieved through this work, in particular because there was 800 million or so being spent on it. A concern about whether that represented value for money, and a pressure to spend it on other things, whether that's further down in schools or different kind of routes like apprenticeships. I think what we also see at this time, which is really crucial, is a greater focus on what you might call the other 50%. So the students who weren't going into higher education. Of course, this is affected to a degree by things like the Brexit vote, and other patterns in society where you could see divisions between graduates and non-graduates, both in relation to their backgrounds, also the places in which they tended to live. Also increasing concern about what happens to graduates, whether they are leading into the kind of jobs that justify the investment in higher education. That questioning about increasing higher education participation in itself leads to questioning about some of the assumptions behind it, meritocracy, the pursuit of mobility and what that might mean for the places in which people started from. The human capital theory, as we talked about at the last seminar, and the extent to which graduate skills are ultimately used and valuable to employers. You see much greater debate from 2016 onwards about issues like this. Notwithstanding that, I think you could say that the government, the Conservative government that made the legislative changes in 2017 and introduced the OFS, had a broadly similar view about higher education participation as its predecessors. So it was still committed to increasing participation. It was still committed to widening participation for underrepresented groups. And it labelled its white paper informing the legislation with the words knowledge economy and social mobility. So there's a very similar positioning to its predecessors. What it was trying to do was essentially regulate to try to assure some of the benefits that had been promised from expanding higher education. That, of course, related to access. It also related to quality and the student experience, and to a certain extent, the outcomes, the job outcomes and career outcomes that flowed from that as well. In detail, the Higher Education Funding Council, which I worked for, and offer, which had regulated access, was replaced by a market regulator, the Office for Students. And the Office for Students had quite a different set of powers and levers to the predecessor organisations. It didn't just have the power to refuse a plan, it could make interventions short of that, which meant it could shape behaviour in a rather more nuanced way than the predecessors were able to. And because it was responsible for all aspects of higher education regulation, it was positioned to look right across the student life cycle and try to look at a whole institution approach to not just access, but also participation. The other thing we decided on, and this was pretty much a board decision at our first meeting in January 2018, is that we weren't any longer going to focus so much of our regulation on inputs, on spending, on bursaries, on outreach, a wide range of outreach that might be perceived to be about raising aspirations for students to go to any institution. We were really going to make a push on improving access particularly in the most selective universities where it was weakest, but also improving outcomes across the student life cycle. And in a sense, what we were saying is that meaningful equality of opportunity, so the promotion of equality of opportunity is the basis in the Act. It was in 2004 and it was in 2017. But what we felt was meaningful equality of opportunity, what I might call fair equality of opportunity, required not just kind of fair admissions processes or clear processes and procedures, not just work to remove financial barriers, but actual progress on addressing and reducing inequalities all across the life cycle over time. And that was really the key focus of our work. We did a kind of something for something deal with the sector through all of this. So they said annual regulation prevented progress. We said, okay, we'll give you longer, we'll give you 5 years, but in return, we expect you to make progress on addressing the inequalities across the student life cycle. There are kind of 3 main elements to the work during this period. So firstly, there's a regulation of individual universities and colleges, which, as I've shown on the 3rd bullet here, was about 5-year plans rooted in their own self-assessment of their position. Universities and colleges identifying what we called a theory of change. In other words, what interventions we would make and why to achieve change and make progress and achieve targets that they set themselves. Also, importantly, improving evaluation during this period and trying to use that to improve practice and progress over time. So the plans and the regulations sat at the heart of it. But we also did 2 other important things, I think, during this period. So one is, by bringing HEFGI's powers and capabilities together with Offer, we were able to set up a kind of national infrastructure. So we established a single data dashboard showing the position of every university and for different groups of students within every university across the country. We invested in collaborative outreach, so invested in partnerships in 29 local areas across the country, which were intended to enable universities and colleges to work together on their engagement in schools, ensuring it's targeted and efficient and well evaluated. And we also invested in a national What Works Centre, the Transforming Access and Student Outcomes Centre, which is intended to kind of set standards for evaluation, share evaluation findings and improve practice over time. So you've got pressure on individual universities, but also support at sector level, which were intended to together to kind of achieve the things we wanted to achieve. The third element of it was really trying to champion some issues which we thought were actually absolutely pivotal to making progress, and possibly what you might call the most material inequalities we could see in the system. The first, of course, related to access to the most selective universities, which had been a theme for access regulation throughout. And we considered that assessing students on the basis of their potential to succeed, understanding the context in which their grades had been achieved in order to assess that potential, was actually absolutely crucial for making progress. So we did push hard on that, and most universities in different ways, the most selective universities, have implemented policies along those lines. The second issue was the ethnicity awarding gap between Black and white students in particular, but more broadly, Black, Asian, minority ethnic students and white students. And we stimulated a lot of debate and supported work and promoted practice related to what you might call inclusive learning and teaching practices and inclusive student support, which was looking at how you could address those gaps, the causes of them, and the practices that could be implemented to do it. A lot of that work relied on work by academics in this country, experience in other countries, sharing policies and practice from other countries to show universities in this country what peers were doing, how they could do that themselves. In January 2020 and in March 2021, we published statistical analysis and evaluations of the effects of these changes, so the shift to 5-year plans and the other aspects of it. And I think what that did show is that there was more senior level engagement with access and participation as an issue, governing bodies and senior management teams taking more ownership of it, more ambitious plans having been agreed, particular commitments to make a step change on access to high tariff universities and address ethnicity and other awarding gaps within universities, and more whole institution approaches, so different parts of universities working together on all of this. Even while we were publishing the analysis, though, I think we were aware that there was some big change on the horizon, and there are kind of two main elements to all of that. So the first, as you all know, was the direct disruption from COVID flowing through from February 2020, which disrupted learning, teaching and assessment, both in schools, but also colleges and universities. And of course, what we saw was those of you working on access and participation work in universities had to make changes to your plans to ensure you could support some of the most vulnerable students during that period. Universities couldn't engage with schools in quite the same way. But perhaps most profoundly, we saw the greatest loss of learning, whether in schools or in universities, among the poorest and most disadvantaged students, and indeed the poorest and most disadvantaged places and communities. And I think you can see that very clearly in the latest GCSE and A-level grades, which in turn flow through to university admissions in 2021. So if you look at 2021 university admissions, you can see that actually there are record numbers of students from the most underrepresented groups, which is a good story, but even more from the most represented. So yet again, what COVID has yielded is improving and expanding opportunity, but not progress on quality of opportunities. And that in itself has been okay this year because there's been enough places in the system to absorb it. But I think that could become a really big problem for the sector and all of us if there are constraints on the number of places in future. And that leads through to the second big change, really, which is what are the prospects for government policy and government funding in relation to participation in higher education during the coming years. I think what we've seen, as I suggested at the start, is that following the December 2019 election, ministers have at least rhetorically pushed back on increasing higher education participation and presented quite a binary picture within which further education and direct entry into work would be favoured instead. Why is that? Well, firstly, there is the arguments I've already mentioned about the opportunities for people and places not well represented in HE. And instead of focusing perhaps on improving the routes into higher education for those people, looking at how you could improve the routes they're already taking, whether that's work or whether that's work or further education. There's also, of course, a cost issue. So the ONS changed the way in which it accounted for tuition fees within the public accounts, and stronger questions about the benefits and the returns to individuals and the nation from the investment in higher education participation. But there's also a degree of ideology as well. So a certain positioning of higher education as an academic route, further education as a vocational and technical route, a desire to have more people gaining practical skills and taking those routes, with school grades earlier in the system crucially determining a clearer set of pathways around the routes that are taken. And that itself is, of course, crucial to the guidance that was issued in November to my successor as Director of Fair Access and Participation. It pushes back on universities focusing on entry and improving access to their own institutions, more towards working earlier on in schools, focusing on supporting individuals in schools rather than perhaps changing organisations and the system in higher education. That will be very difficult to regulate. And there's a whole set of questions about whether student tuition fees should pay for activity in schools and the extent to which universities really can shift patterns of attainment in schools. But that will very much be a theme that flows through from the guidance that was published last year. So in conclusion, I think there's a set of interesting questions about what may happen next during 2022. Will that shift in emphasis that we've seen over the last 2 years in terms of pushing back on higher education participation, pushing other routes, happen in practice? I'm pretty persuaded by people who feel that really the dominant influence over the shape and size of higher education in England over the last 50 to 60 years has been student and family ambitions and expectations. There's been a strong demand push to expand opportunity through higher education. Alongside that, there have also been economic arguments around human capital and knowledge-based jobs, which have been crucial, I think, to persuade, particularly the Treasury, that this is worth supporting. It'd be very difficult for a government to push back on that demand from students and families. But I do think we need to recognise that a student-led system, and we've had in England a very strongly student-led system since 2018, does, if it follows, if that shapes the pattern of provision, it rather exacerbates everything that's happened in school beforehand. So the inequalities we see in school before you get to university get exacerbated. And to a certain extent, it minimises calibration with work as well. And so it maybe exacerbates concerns about whether the courses people are studying, the routes they're taking, are best positioning them for what follows on from that. If I were to say there was one thing we failed to do during the 4 years I was in post, is that we failed to reshape the mode of provision. So what's happened since 2012 is an entrenchment of young, full-time, full degree routes through higher education, and a decline to a certain extent in adults, in shorter cycle provision, in studies whilst in work. And access regulation to a certain extent regulates what universities want to do. They come forward with the proposition and you can't shift that provision. I think in order to address these concerns that we've identified about the benefits of increasing higher education participation, we need a different kind of settlement, a different way of thinking about how further and higher education fit together, enabling collaboration and progression rather than division, and enabling more people to take different routes through the whole system at different times of their life. And then what you need to do is position access regulation in support of that. That's it from me. Thanks, Simon. I will hand back to you and look forward to hearing from Vikki.
And thanks very much, Chris. A very substantial outline of progress or not in relation to widening participation. Now we hear from Vikki Boliver.
Thanks, Simon. Let me just start sharing my screen. Okay, well, thank you, Chris, for a really clear and insightful account of the access regulator, including your tenure with the OFS. Let me just get that to get started. And I actually want to extend my personal thanks to you for some of the really big achievements that you managed to pull off during your leadership of the OFS. And I want to actually use this 5 or so minutes of response time to, first of all, highlight 3 real success stories of the OFS since 2018 that I think are really important to celebrate and hopefully to hold on to going forward. So I'll start with some of the big successes. I'll also mention one thing that I think was a missed opportunity during the last 3 or 4 years. And then I'll end with adding to your reflections as to what might happen in the future with the new leadership of OFS and the new direction of travel with regard to higher education. So I think first and foremost, one of the really big successes of OFS, which owes a lot to your and your team's vision, but also the greater regulatory powers that you had at your disposal, is that for the first time you succeeded in having higher tariff universities held to account in contributing to widening access. So, you know, anyone who's familiar with the access agreements that were submitted to the OFS's predecessor, the Office for Fair Access, would know that the targets that higher tariff university proposed on widening access were extremely minimal, and much of the prose accompanying those targets in the access agreements really bemoaned the dearth of suitably qualified students from disadvantaged backgrounds, and really basically said, you can't expect us to really make more than the most minimal progress on diversifying the student body. And I think the OFS since 2018 has really shifted the thinking and the commitments of higher tariff universities on widening access, and they really have stepped up to this ambition of a 3-to-1 ratio of polar quintile 5 to quintile 1 students by 2024, and the goal of completely equitable access by 2038. So I'm showing you here with the red bars are for the polar quintile ratios in 2017 for the 24 or 25 high tariff universities in England, and the green bars show what the stated ambitions were in the first round of those access and participation plans submitted to OFS. And in every case, you see a real sense of ambition on those targets, much more than we would have seen under the previous regime. So I think that is a huge success story, and that's something that I hope doesn't change going forward, that holding those institutions to that commitment, notwithstanding what's happened with the COVID situation over the past 2 years. And as you've said, Chris, there's been an expansion of opportunity, but not an equalisation as of yet. I hope that these targets will still hold and that there will still be a real drive to achieve them. The second and related big success story, as you've mentioned, Chris, is really to succeed in mainstreaming contextualised admissions. As you mentioned, almost all higher tariff universities now have some form of contextualised admissions policy in place. And I think it was really important that the OFS drew on academic research and published their own briefings, really highlighting two things. One is that the mathematical necessity of contextualised offers if we're going to make any progress on widening access to higher tariff universities, because we know that there is a small pool of disadvantaged students getting 3 A's, 3 A stars and so on, and then it's just not going to be possible if higher tariff universities ask everybody to jump that high bar of entry requirements. We're just not going to make any progress on widening access. And coupled with that, I think the OFS did a good job of making the case that this is a fair thing to do as well, to assess prior attainment in the context in which it was obtained, the schooling that people had, the communities and the families and the socioeconomic circumstances that surrounded them during their school years. And I think it's really important that universities, higher tariff universities in particular, now increasingly understand that while 3 A's or better might be a stellar achievement for the more advantaged individuals, something like 3 B's or even B's and C's is actually a really high achievement for those, for example, from free school meal backgrounds. The top 10% most qualified 18-year-olds from free school meal backgrounds have B, C, C and above, and very few have AAA or better. So I think it's really important that the OFS was able to convince in various ways higher tariff universities that contextualised admissions is both necessary and the ethical way to proceed in terms of trying to widen access. The third thing that I wanted to point to, and you've mentioned this already, Chris, is really pushing universities to take on more responsibility for the awarding gaps, both by particularly in relation to ethnic inequalities in degree classifications that aren't explained by grades on entry or the subjects that people have chosen to study, also socioeconomic gaps in retention and achievement, and an analysis of the access and participation plans that were produced for OFS show that all of these high tariff universities are taking some ownership now of those degree awarding gaps, and are trying to make changes to the way that they teach and learn and to the wider culture of the university, making it more inclusive and doing much more to support students to learn, rather than saying, well, we just have a traditional system of teaching here, there are lectures and most of it is independent study and they go off and figure it out for themselves. So I think that's been really, really valuable step change in the thinking around fairness in relation to university access and participation. Now, I did want to point to one area where I think OFS missed the target for reasons that I still don't quite understand, despite our many conversations, Chris, about this. And this is the continued use of area level measures to define who underrepresented and disadvantaged groups are. And I'm showing you some evidence here from a paper that's soon to be published in the British Journal of Sociology of Education that looks at how well the polar measure and the more recently introduced Tundra measure based on postcodes and HE participation rates in local areas, how well those measures overlap with another individual level measure of disadvantage that we know to be a really accurate indicator that somebody is disadvantaged, namely having ever been recorded as in receipt of free school meals during secondary education. And what's really important is that most young people who were in receipt of free school meals and are from low-income families, most of them are not in these Polar 1 or even Polar 1-2 quintile areas. They live elsewhere, so they're not going to be captured by this measure. They're not going to benefit from contextual offers that are aimed at Polar quintile 1 and 2 individuals. And most people who live in these Polar 1-2 quintiles are not free school meals recipients, and so are possible false positives. Some of them will be disadvantaged, no doubt, but there'll be substantial proportions who are not disadvantaged, but who are nevertheless going to benefit from contextualised admissions and other widening access policies that use this area level measure as the targeting method. Finally, I just want to add a few things to what you've said already, Chris, about what might happen under the new leadership of the OFS and what the implications might be for the legacy of the OFS so far and these really positive developments that I've mentioned. So if you look at the OFS's new consultation on its strategy going forward, it's very clear that there are two items of focus. First of all, quality and standards, and it's yet to be really spelled out. It will be following the consultation that it will be spelled out exactly what is meant by that, but there are obviously indications from what ministers and others have said about what they mean by quality and standards. And in the strategy consultation document, it clearly indicates that there is an intention to make sure that universities are permitted to function as they do now, provided that the student outcomes, i.e. degree achievement, retention, and in particular, graduate labour market outcomes are considered good enough. And I think that's quite concerning because, first of all, higher education institutions and the supply of graduates doesn't in and of itself affect the labour market demand for graduate level employees. This is not within the power of universities to influence the occupational class structure. But perhaps more importantly, there are real questions as to why some universities and some courses have these higher returns on the graduate labour market. The IFS have produced some really interesting reports trying to disaggregate the contributing factors to the wide variation in graduate salaries. And we really need to do a lot more work, I think, in working out to what extent does a Russell Group degree give you a better salary because it's a better quality education versus it's simply a more prestigious institution with more name recognition and a historic and contemporary association with social elites. To what extent is it really the cultural and social capital of the typical graduates of those universities who are often from professional and socioeconomically advantaged backgrounds themselves? So I think there's a real concern that this focus on universities being judged by their graduate outcomes, while there are many positives that we can think of in relation to that, most likely what will happen is that the current prestige hierarchy of universities will be further elongated as institutions come to be relabeled and re-emphasized that they're high quality or low quality institutions based on their graduate outcomes. There's implications for reduced fee levels at so-called low quality institutions, potentially the forced closure of those institutions or the repurposing of them as more vocational non-degree institutions. And these are the institutions that, as we know, predominantly serve disadvantaged and ethnic minority students. These are the ones that are going to fall out of the bottom of the degree providing higher education sector. The second of the focuses of the proposed new strategy for OFS is around equality of opportunity. And it's perhaps telling that that is the second priority after quality and standards rather than the first priority. And I think there's a real risk there that those very stretching widening access standards that Chris and team managed to set for high tariff providers from 2018 onwards will be reduced, maybe even removed entirely, maybe even reduced substantially for the high quality institutions, based on the argument that if we are going to have some really high quality institutions, we can't expect them to, for example, use contextual offers to widen participation. We need to return to that traditional meritocratic system where it's only those the most stellar qualifications that get to go to these institutions. So I think there is a real risk that some of the really positive developments in the last few years will be washed away potentially over the coming years. And I'll stop there so we can open it up for discussion.
Well, thanks very much, Vikki. And I think there, Chris, you have the verdict. I mean, considerable achievement in 4 years. And, you know, we all know how hard it is to shift things in this area, you know, how much attitudinal change is needed, how widespread it has to be, and how much the structures themselves are in play, and how difficult it is to change structures. And you've achieved a lot. Incomplete achievement. I think Vikki's pinpointed the areas. You're aware of some of them yourself. And of course, no one knows the future. We don't know where it'll go from here, whether these achievements will be lasting or to what extent they'll be lasting, whether the OFS will be able to build on them further, or whether we'll be pushed back on the equity issues. The struggle continues, so to speak. We haven't got a lot of time left, so what I'll do is bring in a number of people now, get them to say something, and then give you the opportunity to reply. So to use your public discussion skills, we'll bring in, I think, the first 3 people, and they'll be Johnny Rich, Adele Ruston, and Edward Hicks. So be prepared, colleagues, and Johnny Rich is first. Johnny.
Thanks very much. Happy New Year, everyone. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Vikki. And thanks, Simon. I wanted to ask about where we should draw the line between what HEIs do in terms of outreach and what is historically the proper activity of schools in delivering high attainment or delivering careers education, information, advice and guidance, because over the past dozen years or so, the funding for those things this government funding for those things has perhaps arguably been cut and been replaced by universities getting involved in doing those things in schools through outreach. And I was wondering if you believe that characterization to be true, and certainly the plan of the new DFAP seems to be that the attainment raising work will be expanded. And does that step on the toes of schools? Does that support schools? Where should the line be? And is there a problem here? Is there a danger here in universities getting too involved in careers, education, information, advice and guidance when they might be seen to have a vested interest in a certain outcome?
So hold your response there, Chris, and we'll bring in Adele Ruston, who's, I think, had 2 different questions she wanted to raise.
So my first question was just mainly on the use of the association of behavioural characteristics data and whether or not you feel universities might be set targets around that moving forward, or as if that's the approach potentially that might be used instead of POLAR moving forward. And then my second question was really around the rumours about minimum entry requirements and whether or not that's really a sensible idea for student loans and for student funding, and the impact that potentially might have then on widening participation and students from disadvantaged groups who are likely to underperform at GCSE level.
And our third question is from Edward Hicks.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much to both the speakers. It's been very interesting. My question is about contextual emissions. And I suppose, how much do you see it as an end in itself about identifying candidates or groups of candidates that have the greatest potential, perhaps based on data around the degree outcomes and retention? regardless perhaps of who those groups might be, how much should it be a sort of means to an end solely with the aim of widening participation? And I suppose in relation to this, and I know Professor Boliver has talked about this before, how much does the data on those areas actually support saying that actually those two things both interconnect, the widening participation and contextual emissions always go together?
Chris.
Okay, so on Johnny's question, so universities make really important contributions to schools, and I say this in the paper that we've published this afternoon. I'm sitting in a university that runs a school and runs teacher training and does a huge amount of research and evaluation that on what happens in schools. But ultimately, what happens in relation to the attainment gap, and it's the attainment gap that has driven a lot of the inequalities in relation to access over the last decade, will be due to the efforts and the investment in schools rather than universities. So I think it's important to encourage universities like this one to do some of the great work they're doing with schools, but not assume that they can ultimately be held to account for that, or that they're going to save the day in relation to the attainment gap. And again, one of the things I say in the paper today is the guidance from the government recognises and suggests there have been changes to standards in schools over the last decade, but it doesn't recognise the failure to reduce the attainment gap. So, and that's going to be really crucial during the coming years. If not, then you have to look at what are the routes into higher education. For young people, contextual admissions in that system where there's such inequalities are, in my view, a robust assessment of potential. If you use a nuanced basket of measures, you can start to understand the distance travelled and potential to succeed. That's important to be fair to the individuals, in my view. It's crucial to making any progress on access, which all governments have said they want to do over the last few years. And then Vikki has written much more intelligent work than I have about issues like justice in relation to this and fairness. But even that in itself is short of what you see in some other countries where there are more explicit crafting the class policies, recognizing the value of educational diversity. On the measures to be used on future, so even I take on the chin Vikki's critique of Polo and the flaws of place-based measures. I think the places that are most underrepresented are many of the places that are a priority for policy currently, former industrial towns and coastal towns, which haven't benefited from higher education expansion. So it's important that we do improve access in those places. But of course, individuals in those places may or may not be disadvantaged. I think the ABC's work that the OFS did showed that if you captured the quintile 1 places and you captured free school meals, you captured virtually all of the people, the quintile that's most underrepresented in higher education. And so I think there will be an interest in how you look at these combinations together in the future, whether that's through a basket of measures to inform contextual admissions or other policies as well. Hopefully that's dealt to a degree with the schools question, the measures question, and the contextual admissions question.
Thanks, Chris. Well done. And let's bring in 2 further questions, one from Francis Green and the other from King Alexander. So Francis, you're first.
I just bring myself up front, I hope. Thanks very much to both speakers, really enjoyable. You may know that I have an interest particularly in private schooling, and much from Vikki's work in particular, know about disproportionate access to private school pupils to high status universities. So my simple question is, to what extent do you think contextual admissions criteria have been focused on school type? Sometimes I've noticed that it's mentioned specifically in various criteria, for example, at Oxford University and some of the colleges there, but probably I think rather more rarely outside Oxford and Cambridge. And as a consequence of that, has it made any difference, do you think, that's yet affected specifically, or is it just the general social background criteria that are put in there? Thank you.
And our final question will come from King Alexander, a question from the United States. King. Hello, King, are you there? If King doesn't come in, Chris, I think you have the opportunity to reply.
Okay.
King? No, go ahead, Chris.
I'll start on Francis's question, but it'd be important to hear Vikki also. So yeah, I know I've read your book on private schooling, Francis, and I have a lot of sympathy with it. I think we were fairly cautious about that on its own being an indicator because of course, there's a hell of a lot of advantage even within the state sector. And I know that having been in the state sector myself and my children being in the state sector. So we wanted to get, dig down further, deeper into real disadvantages where you get to, Vikki's point about free school meals, etc. But I think you can see some universities including it as part of a basket of measures around contextual admissions. And I know that Oxford and Cambridge in particular have been concerned about state schools, and that reflects long-standing pressure on that issue, actually stemming through the whole timescale I showed in my session.
Thanks, Chris. And I think we've reached the close. Perhaps a final word from Vikki.
To add to what Chris was just saying about, sorry, my cat's clawing the sofa. Yeah, sorry. Private schools, contextual admissions criteria. I think it's really quite difficult to know whether they make a dent on private school admissions, because it's only fairly recently that most high tariff universities are now doing some form of contextual admissions, and it's happened in this really wacky period of COVID, where the grade achievements were skewed more in favour of private schools than in a normal year. So only time will tell. But I think, as Chris said, the category of not having gone to a private school is such a huge category and so diverse that it's not actually very good at honing in on the most disadvantaged. At best, you could perhaps use it as an exclusion criteria. So you definitely wouldn't be considered for a contextual offer if you had attended a private school, but you wouldn't definitely be considered for one just because you went to a state school. I really think these individual level measures that definitely capture disadvantage are what are needed.
I want to thank you both for the brilliant clarity at which you outlined what you wanted to say and provided slides that supported it. This is going to be a very good YouTube record, and it's great to have this rare opportunity to put on record the achievements of someone coming out of a major public post like this. Something of a high watermark, Chris, although we hope against perhaps our intellectual judgment that this is not the high watermark and that things will move forward. I think you've created a lot of momentum in the sector. I mean, I noticed the change that has occurred at Oxford in the last 3 years, and I do think that your work at OFS has been primary in driving that kind of sea change inside the institution, now with a very significant constituency which is determined to push ahead radically on opening up access at Oxford. And I think there's similar sorts of responses, as Vikki said, in high tariff institutions across the country. So we need to provide support for that that process of conscious change. Really, really good to see everyone again. Really good to open up. Really good to have 100 people here. And we look forward to our next webinar, which is on Thursday, and it involves Peter Scott. Peter's going to be presenting a book which he's recently released called Retreat or Resolution, Tackling the Crisis of Mass Higher Education. And there's no one who knows more about higher education in the UK, arguably, than Peter Scott. So we really look forward to hearing from him. Thanks very much, Chris. Thanks very much, Vikki. Thanks to everyone, and goodbye for now.
Thank you.